In a quiet prison, a man stood on the edge of his fate, hours away from facing the consequences of his actions. The world had already cast its judgment, but the question remained, did the justice system get it right? As his final moments approached, the truth, long buried, would finally come to light. What had pushed him to this point? What series of choices had led a seemingly ordinary person down this path, and how far had the system failed to notice until it was too late? For months, the story had been in the shadows, whispers of his past, the crime, and what had been ignored. But no one knew the full truth. No one could have predicted how this story would unfold. Welcome back to Fatal Verdict. In today's video, I will take you through the timeline of the life of Ian Watkins, a man whose rise to fame as a rock star would eventually be overshadowed by the shocking truth behind his actions. We'll begin by diving into his early life, understanding the path that led him down a dark road. Then, we'll examine the crime that shocked the world, what really happened that night, and how it unfolded. From there, we'll follow the investigation that pieced together the details and uncovered the disturbing truth. We'll also walk through the courtroom drama, the verdict, and ultimately, the final moments of Ian Watkins. Stay tuned as we dig into the chilling details of this case and explore the impact it had on the victims, the public, and the justice system. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on our latest true crime documentaries. For those of you who choose not to subscribe, kindly let us know why in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. In 2008, the arrest of Ian Watkins sent shockwaves through the music industry. The frontman of the popular Welsh band Lostprophets, once admired by fans and peers alike, was now facing allegations that would change everything. The case that followed would not just affect his career, it would raise disturbing questions about the power of influence and the hidden actions of those we trust. The investigation began quietly, but what detectives uncovered soon became public knowledge. Watkins, a man adored by millions, had been hiding a much darker side. It wasn't just his fame that allowed him to remain undetected for so long. It was his calculated manipulation of trust which shielded his actions from the public eye. Behind the stage lights and the screaming fans, Watkins had orchestrated a life of secrecy. What seemed like a story of a successful rock star was, in reality, one of power, deceit, and harm. But how had someone with so much to lose been able to carry out such actions in plain sight? The truth was revealed piece by piece, starting with a tip-off that led investigators to evidence pointing to Watkins' abuse of trust. The case wasn't just about a celebrity crossing boundaries, it was about a pattern of behavior that had been hidden for years. What detectives uncovered left many in disbelief. How could someone, once seen as a symbol of youthful rebellion, be responsible for actions that no one could have imagined? Watkins' fame had shielded him, allowing his darkest secrets to remain hidden from public scrutiny. The police investigation revealed a chilling pattern, but there were still many questions left unanswered. The case evolved from an investigation into misconduct to one that exposed a much deeper and more disturbing story, one about manipulation and the abuse of power. As details emerged, the victims' voices were finally heard. The investigation wasn't just about uncovering a crime. It was about understanding the psychological grip that Watkins had over those around him. As the investigation progressed, the public's perception of the once popular musician began to shift, but the emotional toll on those involved would last far longer than the headlines. This documentary will take you through the timeline of the crime, the investigation that followed, and the trial that would seal Watkins' fate. We'll examine not just the evidence, but the psychological and emotional impact that came with it. What drove Watkins to commit such acts? And how did he manage to evade justice for so long?
Ian Watkins, once known as the energetic frontman of the Welsh band Lostprophets, was celebrated for his electrifying performances and charisma. However, beneath the public persona of the popular rock star, there was a far darker reality, a side of Watkins that would eventually come to light and alter the course of his life forever. Born in 1977 in Wales, Watkins grew up in an environment that shaped much of his later life. His early years were marked by family instability and struggles with identity, compounded by a difficult relationship with his parents. As a teenager, he sought refuge in music, finding success with Lostprophets, but this public success masked deeper issues that were beginning to surface. His rise to fame allowed him to gain significant influence, but it also exposed him to pressures that contributed to his psychological struggles. Despite his fame, Watkins was never able to escape the demons of his past. He became known for his charismatic yet erratic behavior, and his struggles with emotional instability were often overshadowed by his public image. What seemed like the trappings of a successful rock star, luxury, attention, and adoration, only added to his internal conflict. As his fame grew, so too did his need for control over those around him. This need would later become evident in the disturbing ways he manipulated and took advantage of vulnerable individuals. While his public persona remained one of success, the reality of his personal life was quite different. His behavior began to raise concerns among those who were close to him, but his fame and influence allowed him to avoid scrutiny for years. It wasn't until the investigation into his actions began that the true nature of his crimes started to surface. The victim, whose identity remained protected for some time, was one of many whose lives were drastically affected by Watkins. They were part of the complex web of manipulation he had woven, one in which trust and vulnerability were exploited for his own gain. This individual, like others, was drawn into Watkins' orbit, believing in the facade of the famous rock star, who behind closed doors was a much different person.
The victim's life, once full of hope and possibilities, was changed in ways they could not have anticipated. The psychological control exercised over them by Watkins was difficult to see, but it was damaging nonetheless. Their courage in coming forward would be a pivotal moment, not only for the case, but for the eventual uncovering of the extent of Watkins' abuse of power. It was through their bravery that the investigation gained momentum, eventually revealing the full scope of his actions. The crime that Watkins committed was not one of a momentary lapse in judgment, but a part of a troubling pattern of manipulation and deceit. As law enforcement began to connect the dots, the public's perception of the once popular musician began to shift. His actions, long hidden from the world, were now being exposed piece by piece. The question that arose in the wake of this discovery was not just about what Watkins had done, but how he had managed to operate with such impunity for so long. Watkins' story is one of a person whose public life and private struggles collided in devastating ways. What began as a series of emotional and psychological issues grew into a pattern of behavior that harmed those who trusted him the most. His journey from celebrated musician to convicted criminal raises profound questions about the abuse of power and the system that failed to notice the warning signs. The victim, through their actions, became part of a larger story, one that not only involved a famous musician, but also exposed the vulnerabilities of those who become ensnared by the lure of fame and power. As the investigation unfolded, the emotional and psychological toll of the case became clear, and the true scale of the abuse Watkins had perpetrated was revealed. In the days before Ian Watkins' arrest, a noticeable change began to take place in his behavior. The man who had once thrived in the spotlight now seemed increasingly withdrawn. Watkins, who had always been the center of attention, started distancing himself from those closest to him.
Friends and colleagues began to sense that something was wrong, but the cause wasn't clear at first. He became more isolated, spending long periods alone and avoiding social interactions that once came easily. His interactions with bandmates, once filled with energy and laughter, became strained. His focus shifted, and his demeanor grew darker. While there had been signs of his instability in the past, these recent changes felt different. Those who were close to him began noticing that his behavior wasn't just erratic, it was calculated. Conversations with him began to feel controlled, as though he was consciously manipulating the situation. There were moments when his usual charm turned into something more unsettling. The change was subtle, but it left a lingering sense of discomfort. Watkins also started to show signs of paranoia. He was observed acting secretive, keeping his personal life more guarded than before. His interactions became increasingly tense, and he showed little interest in the things that had once brought him joy. His attitude grew more controlling, especially with those he was close to, which raised concerns among those around him. The sense of unease grew as the days passed, but no one could have predicted the full extent of his actions. As his isolation deepened, it became clear that Watkins was not just dealing with personal issues, he was preparing for something far darker, something that would soon come to light in the most shocking way.
The day of the crime began like any other for Jan Watkins. From the outside, everything seemed normal, but behind the scenes, tensions were building. Watkins had made plans, meticulously arranged, and by the time the day arrived, he was ready to execute his plan. Watkins had always been able to maintain his calm in front of others, but on that day, something felt different. As the hours ticked down, those who interacted with him noticed a subtle shift. There was a coldness, a detachment in his manner. It was as though the person they had once known was slipping away, replaced by someone with a very different agenda. The meeting was set to take place in a private setting, away from the public eye. It seemed like the ideal location for someone determined to keep their actions concealed. Watkins used his position of influence, drawing in individuals who had placed their trust in him. They didn't know it at the time, but they were stepping into a situation that would change their lives forever. As the meeting began, Watkins appeared calm and collected, maintaining his usual charisma. But beneath this facade, his mind was consumed with his plan. He had everything in place, or so he thought. What Watkins failed to anticipate was the fact that his meticulous planning would soon unravel due to one small mistake, a mistake that would later become critical in the investigation.
The interaction between Watkins and the victims began to take a troubling turn as he tried to manipulate the situation to his advantage. His words, once charming, now carried an underlying tone of control. At this point, those involved had no idea that what began as an innocent encounter would soon escalate into something far more serious. Throughout the encounter, Watkins was calculating, yet there were moments when his actions seemed off, moments that would later become significant. One key action, something overlooked by many at the time, would end up being a crucial clue in the investigation. This was the mistake that would break the case wide open, revealing the truth to the authorities. The tension in the air grew thicker as the meeting continued. Despite his calm demeanor, Watkins was on edge. What he hadn't accounted for was the eventual breakdown of his carefully constructed plan. In the days that followed, it would become clear that this was the beginning of the end for him. When the meeting concluded, Watkins believed he had covered his tracks, that he had escaped detection. But the truth was already starting to emerge. The evidence would soon catch up with him, piece by piece, as investigators began to uncover the reality of what had transpired that day. What Watkins thought was an isolated incident would soon spiral into a full-blown investigation that would reveal the extent of his actions. He had underestimated the power of the truth, and now it was only a matter of time before the consequences of that day would catch up with him. The investigation into Ian Watkins' actions began cautiously, with law enforcement lacking the immediate evidence they needed to make an arrest. Initially, the case seemed difficult to crack, given the complexity of Watkins' public persona and the careful steps he had taken to avoid detection. There were no obvious signs that would point directly to him, and for a time, the investigation appeared to stall. However, law enforcement was determined. They knew that even the smallest detail could help them uncover the truth. As they began to examine his behavior and actions, they found that what appeared to be a well-crafted public image was in fact a cover for darker behaviors that had been hidden from public view for years.
The investigation into Ian Watkins' actions began cautiously, with law enforcement initially unaware of the full scope of his crimes. Watkins, once the lead singer of the popular band Lostprophets, was arrested for serious criminal offenses involving minors. The charges were deeply troubling, given his fame. Watkins had used his celebrity status to manipulate and exploit vulnerable individuals, some of whom were young. The investigation gained momentum when individuals came forward, revealing how Watkins had used his influence to take advantage of them. Forensic teams quickly began examining Watkins' digital communications, leading to the discovery of crucial evidence. These communications revealed the extent of his exploitation and solidified the case against him. As investigators examined his digital footprint, it became clear that Watkins had made significant efforts to hide his actions. However, critical evidence was uncovered, connecting him to the crimes and exposing the full scale of his misconduct. Watkins' trial was a highly publicized event, largely due to the severity of his crimes. He faced charges related to abusive behavior involving minors and attempting to engage in illegal activities. The prosecution's case was built on overwhelming forensic evidence, including disturbing digital traces found on his devices and the testimony of those he had harmed. The court heard about how Watkins had manipulated young individuals, using his fame to prey on vulnerable people. The gravity of his actions left little room for defense, and the details of his conduct were revealed to the public. The defense attempted to argue that Watkins' past and psychological state had influenced his actions, but this argument was overshadowed by the indisputable evidence. The trial focused heavily on the accounts of those affected by his actions, with several individuals courageously taking the stand to share their experiences. Ultimately, the jury found Watkins guilty on multiple charges involving abusive conduct, marking the conclusion of a case that had caused deep emotional pain for many. The courtroom was filled with mixed emotions: relief from those who had followed the case, and sorrow from the victims who had spent years grappling with the trauma he had caused. For the victims, the conviction was not just a legal win, it was an emotional moment of closure. For Watkins, the verdict marked the end of a career, a reputation, and any hope for redemption. The reactions in the courtroom were intense. Some expressed relief that justice had been served, while others, particularly the victims, were left to process what had happened. The trial had brought long-hidden truths to light, but for many, the emotional scars would remain long after the verdict was rendered. In the end, the trial revealed much more than the specific actions of one individual. It uncovered how power, control, and manipulation could thrive in the shadows. Watkins, who had once been a symbol of youthful rebellion and success, was now facing the full weight of his actions. His trial was a reminder that even those who seem invincible can fall, and that the truth, no matter how long buried, always has a way of emerging.
Ian Watkins's death in prison came as a shock, though it wasn't entirely unexpected. Watkins, once the celebrated lead singer of Lostprophets, had been convicted of a series of heinous crimes that left his victims shattered and the public appalled. After a lengthy trial, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, where he would serve time for his manipulation and exploitation of vulnerable individuals. However, his time behind bars would end in violence at the hands of fellow inmate Mark Jones. Jones, a man serving time for unrelated crimes, had long followed Watkins' case and developed a deep disdain for him. On the day of Watkins' death, Jones, fueled by the hatred he felt for the former Rockstar's crimes, carried out a brutal attack. Watkins, who had become a notorious figure in the prison system, was attacked in his cell. Reports indicated that the assault was swift, with Jones using a makeshift weapon to carry out the attack. The guards responded quickly, but by then, it was too late. Watkins was dead. The prison's response was immediate. While the authorities acknowledged the incident, they emphasized that prison violence, while tragic, was not uncommon. But for many, the question of whether Watkins' death was an act of justice or a symptom of deeper issues in the prison system loomed large. Some felt a sense of closure, particularly the victims' families, who had endured years of suffering as a result of Watkins' actions. In the aftermath, the public reacted in varying ways. For some, Watkins' death brought a sense of finality to a story that had plagued the media for years. His victims, though, were left to wrestle with the emotions that came with knowing that Watkins had paid the ultimate price, but not in a way that felt entirely satisfying. The legal process had been long and drawn out, and while his death closed one chapter, it didn't offer a complete sense of justice for those affected by his actions.
The media's response was equally mixed. News outlets focused on the dramatic nature of the event, an inmate taking justice into his own hands. Others were quick to condemn the violence that had taken place. The situation raised concerns about the nature of prison justice and whether the system had failed in keeping Watkins safe. For the victims' families, the reactions were complex. While many were relieved that Watkins would never again be able to harm anyone, others found it difficult to reconcile with the idea of his death in prison. The pain of his victims was not erased by his passing, and for some, the questions about how to heal from such trauma persisted long after the news broke. Their journeys toward recovery were far from over, and Watkins' death, while significant, was not a cure for the scars his crimes had left behind. His life's tragic end left an imprint on all who had followed his rise and fall. His death was the final chapter in a story that was far from simple, but it left a lasting effect on those who had been involved in the case from the beginning. Since Ian Watkins' death in prison, the case has continued to stir discussion, even as it seemed to have reached its final chapter. While the immediate reaction to Watkins' death brought a sense of closure for some, particularly the victims and their families, the ripple effects of his crimes remain a point of public concern.
Reports revealed that Watkins had continued to exert a level of control over some inmates, with many questioning how he was allowed to manipulate situations from behind bars. This raised concerns about whether the prison system had fully contained his dangerous behavior, leading to discussions on how to handle such high-profile inmates. Several media outlets revisited Watkins' case, drawing attention to previously overlooked details. Some of these revelations suggested that Watkins may have been involved in more complex schemes than initially believed, but no new substantial evidence came to light to support these claims. Despite the lack of new evidence, these reports kept public interest alive and contributed to a wider conversation about the vulnerabilities within the criminal justice system. The media's coverage continued to shape public opinion, with some arguing that Watkins' death marked the end of a long and painful process for the victims, while others highlighted the broader issues related to prison violence. Debates surrounding vigilante justice within the prison system also became a focal point. For the victims, while the legal process had reached its conclusion, the emotional toll remained. The case was not just about the finality of justice, but the ongoing conversations about how the system deals with celebrity-driven exploitation and the lasting impact on those affected. Ian Watkins' death in prison is unsettling. While some will call it justice, I can't help but wonder, is it truly justice when someone dies behind bars at the hands of another inmate rather than the legal system? Prison violence is a systemic failure, yet we cheer it on when it serves our desire for retribution. Does this mean we're okay with a system where justice is dealt with in blood, not law? And what about the victims? Does their pain end with Watkins' death, or does it only fuel the never-ending cycle of trauma? Watkins may be gone, but has true justice been served? Or have we just grown numb to the violence and let the system off the hook? Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.